علينا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم. So, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everybody. Thank you for attending on I think it appears that some people thought because classes were canceled, this is canceled. We're not really tied to Western. We're just using the space to make it convenient for you. So, um, uh, today is just another regular day. Alaikum salam, mashallah. And as we will cover, inshallah, there is some changes to the schedule that I already kind of presented earlier. So I'll go over that very briefly, and then we'll continue, inshallah, where we left off. Just a quick show of hands, though. How many are attending their first session today? Okay, mashallah. See, most people are new. The old people are not coming back, so it must be scaring them away. So that's good. The people out of the people that just put their hands up, are you registered? If you're registered as a credit, keep your hand up. Okay. Okay. No, but you've been here before, many times. Yeah. So there's no problem in auditing the course, certainly. But for those who are taking it as credit, there's going to be obviously some assignments and smaller assessments as part of the IDA Academy. If you're interested in becoming a credit student, because it counts towards a credit towards the academy, where there's a list of courses offered by alhamdulillah our shuyukh and imams across the city. If you want to gain the credit for that academy, I would encourage you to sign up as a credit student. The goal, inshallah, is to get this academy. I don't know how long it will take, but to get it accredited, inshallah. So obviously it takes a long time to do that, but and we're not going to wait for that to start. So it's there's benefit, inshallah ta'ala, with getting the credit. But you're also more than welcome to just audit the course. You don't have the responsibility for the assignments, but then again, you don't get you don't get the credit. There is an attendance sheet going around, Ahmed?
Yeah.
Okay. So please just note your name and just for today. After today, that we will not be accepting any more credit students. So we will have a standard list to just print off and where people can just check off. So we'll get that. Make sure you sign it. Even if you're an audit student, make sure you give your name and your email if you're first time joining, because we have a Zoom session one of the weeks, and you'll miss out on the link if we don't have your contact info. So I don't know what's wrong with this thing. Only the buttons that right click are working. Okay, here we go. Okay, so the schedule is every Monday 5:30 till 7, the latest. Next session, so a week from today, only credit students will need to come, because there's going to be an in-class assignment. It's only in class, so you just complete it in the class. It's closed book because it's really meant to see if you understand the content so far. We haven't covered much, so there's not much to really to go over, but make sure you listen if you missed the first two. Listen to the audio. It is posted onto the idaacademy.ca portal. And come next week prepared, inshallah, only for credit students. If you want to do it, you're an audit student and you want to really just understand how well you are comprehending the material, you're not going to, you don't have to get marked, but just to give you some feedback, I'm more than happy to give the feedback. The session after that is canceled because of reading week. And again, this is not tied to the university, but I imagine some folks are not from London, so they will go back to home, wherever that is. and I don't want them to be at a disadvantage, so we'll just move that. The following week will be a virtual class, because I'm physically not here. That will be over Zoom, inshallah, and I will send a link for that. Again, if you're a credit student, you will get that automatically. If you're an audit and we don't have your email, the MSA will try to send it through their distribution list, but to guarantee that you're on the list, make sure we have your email. 28th, there's no class. And then the 4th, we're back to normal, inshallah ta'ala, for the rest of the term. Any questions so far? Okay, this is the logistics that we have to do before we start. طيب, let's move on to the tafsir. So far, we've talked already about why we're doing Juz' Amma, so I won't cover that into detail again. But we did cover the first surah of the Juz' of the summary of the Quran, that being Juz' Amma, and that's Surah An-Naba. So I want a little bit more interaction because I don't want to hear myself talking the whole time. What did more than what the slide gives? What did Surah An-Naba talk about? What was the main idea or main concept of Surah An-Naba? Yes. Slide. Say again. Slide. The news, right? Just the news in general, right? And Naba means the news. What news? Right? What news? It's the news of this life. What else? And the hereafter. It's the story of creation and what's happened, what's happening, and what's going to happen. Right? It's befitting that a surah that starts the summary of the Quran talk about what's the context of everything, the purpose of everything. Before we get into the halal and the haram, the commandments, different aspects of concepts of respect to accountability, even though it does talk about accountability, but it's not focused on decisions yet, because we'll talk about that later in the Juz'. It's really meant to provide you with the outline of what the story of life is. Yes.
I'm just going to answer and say it provides readers with a path to righteousness.
Say it again. It's hard to hear you.
A path of righteousness.
Yeah. So it doesn't spell out the path. It tells you that there is a path, and that path you choose. You want to take it or not. So that comes to my next question. What's the punchline of the surah? Does anyone remember the punchline of the surah? You don't have to say it in Arabic if you don't know it.
39th verse.
Yes, very good. So, Inna anzarnakum adaban qariba is the last ayah, right? The warning. But before the warning came the verse that talks about the whole purpose of life, which is the punchline, right? فَمَنْ شَاءَ اتَّخَذَ إِلَىٰ رَبِّهِ مَآبًا. Whoever wills or chooses takes Allah as their destination. So Allah presents to you the story before, what's happened and what's happening, and you came into this creation and everything's ready for you. You had nothing to do with it. All these conveniences, from the energy of the sun that emits, to the fact that you sleep at night to rest, to the fact that you're created in pairs to sustain life, etc., etc. All of this, you had and I had nothing to do with it. We were born into it, and it's all conveniences that Allah created. Then Allah talked about the news of what's to come and the hereafter. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described the two end destinations of the human being, or Jannah and hellfire, and what the characteristics of the people that inhabit both are. What are the two characteristics that Allah used in the surah? What are the names that He used to describe these people? Muslimin? Did He use Muslimin? Muttaqeen. Very good. Muttaqeen. What does muttaqeen mean?
Those who fear upsetting Allah.
Right. So a person who has taqwa is conscious of Allah and is fearful of upsetting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or transgressing his boundaries to obtain his wrath, right? Because taqwa is to avoid something that will gain the displeasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's the good side. What's the bad side? Is it the kafirin? Fasiqeen? Kadhibin? Taghin. Very good. What does taghin mean? Yes. The people who transgress the boundaries, red lines, right? Transgressors. Transgressors have two characteristics we discussed last time, right? What are the two characteristics of transgressors? Somebody who's tagha, taghin. Arrogance, because when you know there's a red line and you cross it on purpose, you're basically saying I'm above that line. I could do whatever I want. I could care less what the consequences are, and I have the ability to do it, so I'm going to do it. There's an element of arrogance. And what's the other one?
Sinning.
Be more specific. What type of sin? Well, it's not. It's actually more general than sinning. It's oppressing, right? Oppression in general, oppressing other people and oppressing yourself, right? That's when you cross a red line, right? So these two elements make up the taghin. So Allah described them both. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave the punchline. Whoever chooses, after now you know the story of life, takes Allah as their final destination. That was Surah An-Naba. Now we move on to the next surah in the cluster, and that's Surah An-Nazi'at. We started it last week. And we said that Surah An-Nazi'at is talking about what? Yes. The nafs. The inner convictions, your consciousness, your psychology that's internal, that commands you to do things. And it's befitting that it's the second surah of the summary of the Quran, because your number one obstacle to the path towards Allah is your nafs. It's the number one problem that you have to address, but it's also the solution to the problem. Because if you solve that problem and your nafs becomes pure, that's what will guide you towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We talked about how people look externally for pleasure and happiness, whether it's wealth, social life, friends, desires, etc., etc. When they don't have to look any further than internal. It's right within your own body, this nafs. And so Surah An-Nazi'at talks about that. The first component in finding your way back to Allah is your nafs. Remember we talked about the path to Allah, the destination, that Allah is the destination. If you choose to take that destination, then the first component you have to address is your nafs. So Surah An-Nazi'at, we covered the first 5 ayat. And we said that some scholars said about these all are 5 oaths. Allah took these oaths. When Allah takes an oath, we said there's 2 things you have to, at least 2 things you should keep in mind. What are those 2 things? Yes.
An oath by, and what also comes after it.
Very good. Excellent. Jazakallah khair. So what Allah is taking the oath by, that's important. And what's coming after the oath is important. It's just as, the example I gave last time. If I say to you, Wallahi al-azim, uqsim billah, and I take an oath by Allah, it's telling you that what I'm about to say is very important. So pay extra attention. Everything in the Quran is important, but now pay extra attention because Allah is taking an oath. By the way, we're not allowed to take an oath by anything but Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of course, can take an oath by anything, and he takes oath by his creation, subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay? Some of these oaths, so these oaths, we said some scholars say they refer to stars or planets. Some say they refer to angels, and we talked about that a little bit last week, that when nazi'ati gharqa are the angels that rip the souls out of the body during death, at the time of death, and that's to describe souls that are wicked. And the Prophet ﷺ told us about these souls, right? He told us ﷺ that these souls are ripped out of the body as if you're pulling out like a skillet out of wet wool. Right? When you have something that's prickly and you're pulling it out of wool that's wet, that's how souls of wicked people are withdrawn with pain and agony, and it rips the internals and the veins from within the bodies, and so that is for the violent outcome of people who are wicked, the souls that are wicked, pulled by the angels, though, because some scholars have said these are talking about the angels. And if we stick to angels, you know, when nashitati nashta is the angels are taking the souls very gently. Of course, these are the souls that believed and did righteous good deeds. So they're gently coming out of the body. And the Prophet ﷺ described to us in his hadith that these souls come out of the body as if water comes out of a jug. Very, very easily, very easy, very smoothly. Okay. And then the rest of the ayat, if the scholars have said that these are referring to angels, describe the angels and how they operate. Now, there's also the other scholars have said that these are referring to the nafs, which is the subject that we're going to focus on because we're focusing on that theme. And we talked about the different types of anfus. There are 3 types we covered. Does anyone remember the 3 types? What are the 3 types of nafs? What's the first ayat referred to? Which nafs? Yes. Yeah, the one that's drowning in sin, and it's very you can't extract any good from it. Okay, very good. What's the second type of sin of nafs? Second ayah. Yes. Say again.
Well, so it's not for everybody, it's still doing well.
Yeah, it's doing well. When it's energetic, it produces good, right? And this aligns again with what we said, Surah Al-Waqi'ah, right? There is Ashab al-Yamin and Ashab al-Shimal, people of the right, people of the left. But there's also a third type of soul, and that's the third ayah. Which one is that? That soul is the one that's exceeding everybody else. They are gracefully gliding. They are racing. Sabihati comes from swimming. Okay. They any opportunity to do good deeds, they race to it, and it's like gracefully doing the work with the best of intentions and the best of manners. فَالسَّابِقَاتِ سَبْقًا. So they race everybody and they beat everybody. فَالْمُدَبِّرَاتِ أَمْرًا. And they set goals. They're not just taking good deeds as they come. Yeah, that's great. But you have to have goals in life. And that goal has to be worthy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's pleasure. It has to be focused, and you have to work towards that goal. These are the souls that are, again, in Surah Al-Waqi'ah, would be as-sabiqun as-sabiqun. Those are the ones who are ahead of everybody, right? أولئك المقربون في جنات النعيم ثلة من الأولين وقليل من الآخرين. That's the challenge that we have, is that there's many of them in the past, historically, but very few in the future. And we are considered, in the time zone of the latter, not the former. So who of us is going to be of that category of as-sabiqun, or the third soul, or nafs that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala swears by? So that's where we got to last time. The opening to the surah. Let's continue, inshallah, reading and doing it together. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يوم ترجف الراجفة تتبعها الرادفة قلوب يومئذ واجفة أبصارها خاشعة يقولون أئنا لمردودون في الحافرة أإذا كنا عظاما نخرة قالوا تلك إذا كرة خاسرة فإنما هي زجرة واحدة فإذا هم بالساهرة. Okay, so يوم ترجف الراجفة. So you notice the wording here, ترجف الراجفة. Remember we said last time, if you have a noun and a verb that come from the same root, what does that mean? Say again? Emphasis, right? It's the climax of that action or that verb. It's the pinnacle of that verb. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, for example, وَنَزَّلْنَاهُ تَنزِيلًا, right? يَوْمَ تَرْجُفُ الرَّاجِفَةِ. They come from the same root. Rajafa means to shake violently. Rajifa is a violent earthquake, right? So it's to emphasize that this earthquake is, when you tell somebody an earthquake, they know it shakes. But now tarjufu rajifa, there's a violent shaking to this earthquake. Allah saying on that day when that happens. This is no ordinary earthquake. It's not an earthquake that affects one region only. It's an earthquake that affects everything. The entire world, the whole planet is shaking, very violent. يَوْمَ تَرْجُفُ الرَّاجِفَةِ. And that is the result of the first blow in the horn by Israfil alayhi salam. تَتْبَعُهَا الرَّادِفَةِ. Then it's followed by, radifa is, or radafa is to follow something. So radifa, which comes from radafa, is it's succeeded with something. Again, another shake, another violent shake, which is the result of the second blow in the horn, because we know there's two blows in the horn. قُلُوبٌ يَوْمَئِذٍ وَاجِفَةٌ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, on that day, qulub. First thing, qulub, the hearts. يَوْمَئِذٍ واجفة. Wajifa, we said already, comes from wajafa, means to shake vigorously out of anxiety and fear. When you're in anxiety and fear, why are you in anxiety? Why do people get anxiety? It's because what's to come is uncertain, right? They're not comfortable with what could be coming next. That uncertainty makes people anxious. And so hearts, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't say specific hearts. He said qulub. Qulub, general. Hearts. He didn't say only the hearts of these people. Qulubun yawma idhin wajif. Absaruha khashi'a. Its eyes is khashi'a. It's not khushu'a, khashi'a. It's looking down in humiliation. Again, out of fear. This is not the khushu' that we're talking about in prayer, when your eyes should be in a state of khushu' and you're focusing and concentrating on Allah. This is a type that is a humiliation. And again, out of fear and anxiety. And this is the description of the Day of Judgment. Notice how there's no other description besides these two ayats, because this surah didn't come to talk about the Day of Judgment. It came to talk about qulub and absar, your heart and your eyes, what you feel inside and what you look forward to. Those two things are what make up your consciousness, because the surah is talking about consciousness. The surah is talking about the nafs. So it's talking about the internal state of people on the Day of Judgment. This is the beauty of the Quran. It's how things are tied together. It's not just a description. Again, you can say Allah describes the Day of Judgment in many ways throughout the Quran. But in this particular case, selectively, Allah talks about the hearts and the eyes, because that's what makes up your internal state. قُلُوبٌ يَوْمَئِذٍ وَاجِفَةٌ أَبْصَارُهَا خَاشِعَةٌ. This earthquake, this that shakes everything, that's so violent, is not just a physical shaking, it's also metaphorical. There's no egos on the Day of Judgment. All egos are destroyed with this violent earthquake. So anybody who had an ego internally, an arrogance, is shaken on the Day of Judgment to the point that they're broken down. Nobody has egos on the Day of Judgment. Right? The only instance that people will feel proud and you're allowed to feel proud on the Day of Judgment, is if you receive the book in your right hand. You'll take the book in your right hand. If you receive it in your right hand, you say, read my book. إِنِّي ظَنَنْتُ أَنِّي مُلَاقٍ حِسَابِيَ. I knew I'm going to be accountable for my action. But those are the only people that'll be proud on the Day of Judgment. Right? But in general, قُلُوبٌ يَوْمَئِذٍ وَاجِفَةٌ أَبْصَارُهَا خَاشِعَةٌ يَقُولُونَ أَإِنَّا لَمَرْدُودُونَ فِي الْحَافِرَةِ. They will say, يَقُولُونَ أَإِنَّا لَمَرْدُودُونَ فِي الْحَافِرَةِ is an expression in Arabic. This expression is to say, are we going back to our old state, our previous state? So they ask it in mockery, right? This is where Quran is the miraculousness of the Quran. It's not the shifting in words in terms of time. It shifts, and without going to details, in Arabic there's past, present, and order or command, right? فعل الماضي المضارع والأمر. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala moves between those different types of verbs, but it's to emphasize the meaning. It's not necessarily just to say that people will only ask this at this time. يقولون means they were saying, they used to say, right? That doesn't necessarily have to be only previously. It could apply now. It could apply in the future, because the Quran is not restricted to time with these descriptions. يقولون أئنا لمردودون في الحافرة. Are we going to go back to our old states? أإذا كنا عظاما نخرة. Even if we were decayed bones, really, we're going to come back to how we are now after we become decayed bones? أإذا كنا عظاما نخرة. And the answer is what? After they say قالوا تلك إذن كرة خاسرة. If that was to happen, we would be surely at a loss. If it was to happen. But we don't think it's going to happen. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fixes that and he says, إنما هي زجرة واحد. All it is one call for assembly. One assembly call, and everybody rises from their bones. The dust, the bones that became dust, all come back together, and all of a sudden that human is back into their form. فإنما هي زجرة واحدة فإذا هم بالساهرة. They will find themselves in as-sahira. Sahira comes from Sahara. Does anyone know what Sahara means? Or Sahra, some people use? Not Sahra. Sahra, yes.
Up late.
Yeah, staying up late, right? Sahira is when people stay up late, they don't go to sleep. Sahira is a place where people are not going to sleep. They're going to be there for thousands of years, because we know the Day of Judgment is going to be thousands of years long, right? And people are not going to sleep because of the state of fear they're in and uncertainty. Nobody sleeps. Nobody drowses off. Nobody gets bored. Everybody is full focus and attention until their turn comes. So this is the first section of the surah. فَإِذَا هُمْ بِالسَّاهِرِ. So we're talking now about, we talked from the internal state, the nafs, and now how that nafs, the nufus, will feel on the Day of Judgment. And what people used to say about this Day of Judgment, except everybody will be resurrected and will be there in that place together. Now we shift to the next section, which is actually a beautiful section. So let's read it together. بإذن الله تعالى. هل أتاك حديث موسى إذ ناداه ربه بالوادي المقدس طوى اذهب إلى فرعون إنه طغى فقل هل لك إلى أن تزكى وأهديك إلى ربك فتخشى فأراه الآية الكبرى. So before we talk about Sayyidina Musa, I did want to mention a hadith that I think is important. Because so far what we're encountering is something that obviously is scary, right? The Prophet ﷺ said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يقول الله لا أجمع على عبدي أمنين أو خوفين. I will not have two states of fear or two states of security overcome my servants. Meaning, Allah saying in this hadith Qudsi that a person will not experience two states of fear, nor will they experience two states of security. So the hadith goes on and says, فَإِذَا خَافَنِي فِي الدُّنْيَا أَمَّنْتَهُ يَوْمَ أَجْمَعُ عِبَادِي. That if he or she fears me in dunya, I will give them security in the hereafter. Because there's no two states of fear. You fear Allah now, you will have security in the hereafter. وَإِذَا أَمَنَنِي or أَمِنَنِي فِي الدُّنْيَا خَوَفْتُهُ يَوْمَ أَجْمَعُ عِبَادِي. And if he or she feels secure in dunya, then they will be fearful on the day I resurrect my slaves. So you will not experience two states of fear or two states of security. One of each. You pick which one you want to start with. Based on what you start with, you'll get the other one on the day of judgment. So now we move on to هل أتاك حديث موسى. Has the story of Musa not reached you, O Prophet of Allah? Now, of course, Sayyidina Muhammad already knew that the story of Sayyidina Musa at the time. This is a Meccan surah, but he knew about Sayyidina Musa already. But it's a question to start the dialogue. هل أتاك حديث موسى إذ ناداه ربه بالوادي المقدس طوى. That his Lord called upon him in the sacred valley of Tuwa. Who knows how many times the story of Sayyidina Musa has been mentioned in the Quran? Before that, what rank does Sayyidina Musa have in terms of prophets mentioned in the Quran? The number of times mentioned. First place. By a distance, like no one's even near Sayyidina Musa mentioned in the Quran. Alayhi salam. 73 times. Okay? Why is Sayyidina Musa mentioned so many times? So you know. Our scholars have given us answers for this question. Yes.
He endured so much with
Sorry, say it again.
like first and with Fir'aun, then with Bani Israel.
Yes, that's true. There are other prophets that went through a lot, though, right? It's the similarity of our ummah with Sayyidina Musa's ummah, and Sayyidina Musa with Sayyidina Muhammad alayhi salam in terms of what they went through. So they both were kicked out of their cities, right? They were in Exodus. They both received, obviously, they were both prophets. They both came back to their cities and conquered them again, their people, right? In terms of belief. So they came back victorious. They had to deal with their people who had a lot of issues. And this is why Bani Israel is mentioned so many times in the Quran. It's not storytelling. It's for us not to replicate the same mistakes they had. Their people were oppressed and persecuted, just like the people of the believers at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So many similarities. So it's all a lesson. Bani Israel and Sayyidina Musa's story is a lesson for us, so we don't go back and make the same mistakes. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mentioning the story here again out of those 73 times. But I want you to remember one thing. Never ever read the Quran and say, oh, here's the story of Sayyidina Musa again. Here's the story of Sayyidina Adam again. It's the same story. Let's skip through it. A story is not repeated for the sake of repetition. There is an element of that story that is different in each surah than the rest. And that element is befitting of the surah because it discusses or aligns with the theme of the surah. Here is the story of Sayyidina Musa again. We've already heard it many times before because this is the last chapter of the Quran. So what's so unique about it? اذهب إلى فرعون إنه طغى. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is commanding Sayyidina Musa, go to Fir'aun. إنه what? طغى. How many times have we heard طغى so far? This is the second time, right? Guys, we have to remember these terms that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses to describe people, they're not just random. Allah didn't say إنه كفر. إنه طغى. We already talked about طاغين in Surah An-Naba. Okay? إنه طغى. He has transgressed. He has oppressed himself and other people, and he's arrogant. فَقُلْ هَلْ لَكَ إِلَىٰ أَن تَزَكَّىٰ. So go to him and say, and this is beautiful. قُلْ فَقُلْ هَلْ لَكَ إِلَىٰ أَن تَزَكَّىٰ. This expression in Arabic is like what people say when they're doing a sales job. Okay? May I offer you something that will purify you? This is the only time in the entire Quran, in all of the stories of Sayyidina Musa, where this ayah is mentioned. Say to him, فَقُلْ هَلْ لَكَ إِلَىٰ أَن تَزَكَّىٰ. May I offer you something that will تَزَكَّىٰ, purify you. Why purify? Why in the surah is it talking about purify? Because the theme of the surah is the nafs. So it's not random that this is in the surah. And this is the only time that this is said to Sayyidina Musa. Allah is saying to Sayyidina Musa, ask him, may I offer you something? So it's a gentle way of communication. He didn't go and rebuke him for what he's doing, even though he deserves 100 million times to be rebuked, because we'll see what he did later. May I offer you something to purify you? وَأَهْدِيَكَ إِلَىٰ رَبِّكَ فَتَخْشَىٰ. And that I will guide you to your Lord so that you can have khashya, reverence to your Lord. Again, notice the language. To your Lord. It's not to Allah. It's not to the God. It's to your Lord, to show love, compassion. Your Lord wants you to come back to him. فَقُلْ هَلْ لَكَ إِلَىٰ أَن تَزَكَّىٰ وَأَهْدِيَكَ إِلَىٰ رَبِّكَ فَتَخْشَىٰ. And notice, وَأَهْدِيَكَ came before فَتَخْشَىٰ. Because there's an order here. Because Allah used the word, the harf fa. أَهْدِيَكَ فَتَخْشَىٰ. So one leads to the other. And this is important for us to think about for a second. People expect that they will all of a sudden have reverence, then they will be guided to Allah. That's not how it works. That's not how it works. If the heart is sealed, if the heart has a barrier, it will not find Allah. You have to remove the barrier first in order for it to find Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to have reverence of Allah. So you have to remove that barrier, that veil off of your heart to be able to have reverence of Allah. وَأَهْدِيَكَ إِلَىٰ رَبِّكَ. Then you will have the khashya. Then you will have the reverence. But you have to purify yourself first. That's the equation. Purification of your nafs. You work on that, you will find Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You will get closer to Allah. You'll feel khashya. You will see the taqwa. Right? You start asking yourself, should I be doing this? Or will this upset Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? You know, kids do this amazing, right? Young kids, before they do something, will my parents be upset with me? This is the fitrah, right? The problem is that over time the heart hardens. And so it doesn't see that clearly anymore. It doesn't ask those questions. You got to start polishing the heart for it to start seeing the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَأَهْدِيَكَ إِلَىٰ رَبِّكَ فَتَخْشَىٰ. So after Allah is telling Sayyidina Musa to say this to Fir'aun. And notice the transition in the Quran. This happens all the time. That there will be a conversation and Allah will say to a prophet, in this case Sayyidina Musa, say this. And all of a sudden the transition is the prophet with, in this case Musa with Fir'aun. There's no, and he went and he spoke to him. فَأَرَاهُ الْآيَةَ الْكُبْرَى. So he showed him the ayah, our sign, the greatest sign. Of course, because Juzu Amma is a summary, it doesn't tell you about what the sign is. right? The sign is mentioned before in the Quran. How many signs did Sayyidina Musa come for Fir'aun? Who knows? Yes. 9. Very good. This ayat. Okay. Does anyone know the 9, by the way? I won't spend much time on, but I just thought if you, we'll cover it at some point, inshallah ta'ala. But at least you know 2 of them, right? What are the 2 common ones that people know? Yeah. Splitting the sea. Oh, that's a 3rd one. Yeah. The staff in the hand. Yep. Turning into a snake. And then, oh, the hand. You said the hand. Out of, yeah. So the hand becoming coming out bright as light. And there's other ones too. Locusts and frogs and whatnot. We'll talk about those later. But فَأَرَاهُ الْآيَةَ الْكُبْرَى, and he showed him the great sign. So what happens next? Let's read. فَكَذَّبَ وَعَصَى ثُمَّ أَدْبَرَ يَسْعَى فحشر فنادى فقال أنا ربكم الأعلى فأخذه الله نكال الآخرة والأولى إن في ذلك لعبرة لمن يخشى. So we said in the surah, this surah focuses on the story of Sayyidina Musa from that perspective of the inner conscience, the psychology of the human, your nafs. Any decision you make, by the way, is fueled by a psychological idea or an emotional state. Anything you do has to be justified. You do it to maybe please people. You do it out of fear. You do it so that you can gain something, pleasure, status. People do things that they justify, and it comes from an internal state. This is why there's a lot of focus on the internal state in the surah. Okay? So, Islam as a religion is meant to bring you peace of mind. It's a religion, we say Islam means submit. It's a religion of peace. Peace, not just peace between people, it's internal peace. Because it's meant to teach you how to deal with your internal state. And that internal state modifies or influences our behavior. So, for example, if somebody does not purify their internal state, they will do things for showing off, for instance, because they want status. They want people's recognition. Or for people, for example, will not lower their gaze. They will look at women, they will not lower their gaze. Or they will have any self-discipline. Okay? So these things are built into the human, and if the human doesn't work on them to work to purify them, the internal state, they will influence their behavior. Those instincts or those characteristics that you're built with have to be purified. You have to train your nafs to overcome them. And so Ramadan comes and fasting comes to help you with that, for example. Okay. The Quran came to help us purify ourselves, our nafs. Fir'aun here, when he was told and offered, purify, may I offer you a way to purify yourself, to be a better person, to have khashya and get closer to Allah. What was his immediate response? Did he take time to think about it? How do we know he didn't take time to think about it? It didn't say ثُمَّ كَذَّبَ وَعَصَى. It said فَكَذَّبَ وَعَصَى. Fa means immediately, right after the conversation. كَذَّبَ, he rejected the truth. كَذَّبَ means to reject something you know it's truthful, but you reject it anyway. That's takdhib. Takdhib means you recognize something is truth, but you don't want to accept it. So you reject it. فَكَذَّبَ. So he knew deep down that the message is right. وَعَصَى. And he disobeyed. He disobeyed who? Some people will tell you he disobeyed Sayyidina Musa. But in our context as well, he disobeyed the inner conscience that was telling him, maybe you need to change. Maybe you need to go back to Allah. He rejected that voice. He suppressed that voice. And he disobeyed it. ثُمَّ أَدْبَرَ يَسْعَى. Adbara is to turn his back. يَسْعَى. Yas'a means he rushed. He didn't just take it easy. He rushed. Something, why did he rush? Because something internally was shaken. Just like we talked about the shake, the violent shake. Something internally, he was shaken to his core. How do we know? فَكَذَّبَ وَعَصَى. So after ثُمَّ أَدْبَرَ يَسْعَى فَحَشَرَ فَنَادَى فَقَالَ. All immediate actions. He gathered the people right away. فَحَشَرَ فَنَادَى. He called them. فَقَالَ. And he said to them, أَنَا رَبُّكُمُ الْأَعْلَى. I'm your highest Lord. Not just your Lord. Your highest Lord. Had it not been in the Quran, we wouldn't be saying this phrase that I just said. فَقَالَ أَنَا رَبُّكُمُ الْأَعْلَى. We wouldn't say that. We only say it because it's mentioned in the Quran. It's poor etiquette to say it about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to mention somebody saying that about Allah. But Allah mentions it to show you and me the gravity of the wickedness in his nafs. How does somebody claim to people, I am your highest Lord? How does somebody oppress people to that extent? We can look at Fir'aun and say, oh, it's Fir'aun, it's not us. But Fir'aun started somewhere. Fir'aun started somewhere. He was also a child at one point, just like we were. He grew up just like we did. But it went really bad at some point. Why? And this is why we should never feel secure about ourselves. Because you see the state, he's claiming that he's the highest Lord. That is something he justified to himself. He justified that. That's not something he just invented. He truly believed it. He lied to himself so many times, he started to believe it. And this is what happens to people who lie to themselves over and over. They start believing and they start justifying. And so you see what's happening in Gaza. How do people do this to children? Because they justify it. How? Because they've let their nafs over time get worse and worse and worse. Because if you don't purify your nafs, naturally it's going to become fasida. It's going to become corrupt. أَلَمْ يَأْنِ لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا أَن تَخْشَعَ قُلُوبُهُمْ لِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ وَمَا نَزَلَ مِنَ الْحَقِّ وَلَا يَكُونُوا كَالَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْكِتَابَ فَطَالَ عَلَيْهِمُ الْأَمَدُ فَقَسَتْ قُلُوبُهُم. The equation is like this, brothers and sisters. It's really simple. Your nafs is here. If you don't do anything to work on it, it will be dragged down. The forces against you drag it down. Doing nothing is not a choice. It will become wicked. It will become corrupt. You have to actively work on your nafs to purify it. Because if you don't, it's like a snowball effect. It gets worse and worse and worse to the point that you start justifying killing children as being okay. To the point where you become like Fir'aun and you say, I'm your highest Lord. So, no, I'd never do that. Well, a lot of people thought they would never do X, Y, Z to other people, but they do it now. Why? Because they didn't purify themselves. So we can take it at our level too. We can say, we're doing well. But then we think about ourselves and we say, how many times have we stood up for against injustice? Have we ever behaved or said something that was racist? Or allowed racism to happen in our presence? How are those things acceptable? Well, I didn't want to stand up and say anything because it's not my business, right? You're justifying now. that becomes your state when you let your state be, become corrupt over time. You justify things. It doesn't pertain to me, or I'm an exception, or the rules don't apply to me because I have, special conditions, or somebody forced me to do it. These are justifications for actions that we shouldn't be doing. And this behavior is dictated by the nafs. And so those actions come back to you and corrupt your nafs. This is why we should never justify things that are unacceptable. And we should always look at purifying ourselves. If you are not actively reading the Quran every day or engaged in a halaqah on a regular basis, or reading on a regular basis, I'm talking about reading things that are related to purification of the soul, like tazkiyah, or attending a masjid dars, or listening to shuyukh on YouTube. If you're not doing that regularly, you're not cleaning your heart regularly. It's just like anything that you leave over time. It collects dust. And have you ever encountered a piece of, I don't know, equipment or something that you use that you haven't cleaned for a long time, and it becomes really difficult to clean because it's just been left for years? That's what happens. But if you're cleaning regularly on a daily basis, your heart, your nafs, then it's easy to clean. It's purified. It sees the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So don't leave yourself over time to become, because Fir'aun was racist. If we leave ourselves over time, how do we know we're not going to become racist? How do you know? You can't feel secure from these things. That's the nature of the nafs. I'll share the story. My wife and I were many years ago entered a restaurant, and somebody was leaving the restaurant, and my wife had like a ghost look on her face, like death. And I asked her, what's wrong? What happened? She was so startled. So we sat down. She said, somebody who was a leader in our community, in the Muslim community, who had niqab at one point, just left the restaurant in a miniskirt, no hijab. This was a community leader. How does somebody become like that? No one is safe from that change, because change happens gradually. You don't see it. You always need something to make sure you're recalibrated. Because once you start going down the slope, it's a slippery slope. Snowball effect adds up. And over time, for example, if you're doing all the sunan and all the nawafil, you'll stop doing nawafil. Then you'll stop doing sunan. Then slowly you'll stop doing prayers. Then you'll start doing sins. It's slowly over time. Purification is very important, because that is your vehicle to the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is what the surah talks about. And Allah says, Inna fi dhalika la'ibaratan liman yakhsha. Oh, so before that, sorry. فَأَخَذَهُ اللَّهُ نَكَالَ الْآخِرَةِ وَالْأُولَى. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala seized him, Fir'aun, نَكَالَ الْآخِرَةِ وَالْأُولَى. So publicly, he's punished in dunya and akhirah. How is he punished? How is the punishment in dunya? Of course, he drowned, but his body is preserved till the day of judgment. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is preserving the body of Fir'aun. It's not disintegrated, it's still intact till this day. And it's intact to be a sign. Inna fi dhalika la'ibaratan liman yakhsha. Indeed, in this is a lesson for those who fear. This is the story of Sayyidina Musa. And the context is strictly speaking to the inside. He came to Fir'aun to purify. Fir'aun rejected it. He knew it was the right thing to do. His ego was too big. He didn't want to. His power was too much. He didn't want to give it up. He was oppressing people and commanding them, and he had control over them. He didn't want to give that up. And so he rejected that purification, and then got to the point where he claimed to be the highest Lord. And this is the lesson. Inna fi dhalika la'ibra. Indeed, and this is a lesson for those who fear. So let's continue, inshallah. Any question? Yes. Nakala is like a public display or evidence. Yes, question? I saw a hand up there. Yes.
Is it referring to, sorry, the first transgression and the last, or?
Nakala he's an example, like it's a public punishment, nakal, for everyone to see now. And it's not just going to be a punishment now, but it'll be also a punishment in the akhirah as well. Any other questions? Okay, so let's move on, inshallah. Just to the, I'll mention also the ayah. On the day of judgment, people who, again, got to the state, it doesn't have to be the state of Fir'aun, because the Fir'aun is the worst example. But the state where you let your nafs impure, that it starts to kind of break down. Why do people get to that state? Again, because they don't work on purifying, but also because they lie to themselves and they give excuses to themselves over and over and over. What happens when you lie to people over time?
You start to believe in.
Yeah, you start to believe your lie. You start living that lie. Okay? You think it's true. And Allah describes that in the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يَوْمَ يَبْعَثُهُمُ اللَّهُ جَمِيعًا فَيَحْلِفُونَ لَهُ كَمَا يَحْلِفُونَ لَكُمْ وَيَحْسَبُونَ أَنَّهُمْ عَلَى شَيْءٍ. On the day of judgment, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will resurrect them, and they will يَحْلِفُون, they will take oaths. On that day, they will say, Wallahi, right? Oh, I swear to God, right? On that day, like they used to do to you, كَمَا يَحْلِفُونَ لَكُمْ, and they will think they were truthful. وَيَحْسَبُونَ أَنَّهُمْ عَلَى شَيْءٍ. They will think they're true, that what they're saying is true, because they believe their lies. And this is the danger of it. So let's continue, inshallah. Did I not give the slides for the end of the surah? Oh, shoot. Okay, so I'll read them out, inshallah. If you have a mushaf, you can just join, inshallah. I apologize. I thought I put all the slides in. So إن في ذلك لعبرة لمن يخشى. أأنتم أشد خلقا أم السماء بناها رفع سمكها فسواها وأغطش ليلها وأخرج ضحاها والأرض بعد ذلك دحاها أخرج منها ماءها ومرعاها والجبال أرساها متاعا لكم ولأنعامكم. Okay, so I apologize, I don't have the slides up there. So if you want to follow in the mushaf, it's fine. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala starts the next section. It's interesting. أَأَنْتُمْ أَشَدُّ خَلْقًا أَمِ السَّمَاء. Are you more difficult to create, or the heaven? بناها, he built it. رفع سمكها فسواها. He elevated, samkaha is its thickness. So in its thickness, he elevated it. فسواها, and he made it into a continuous state. You don't see divides in the sky. It's completely clear, right? It's a continuous medium. وَأَغْطَشَ لَيْلَهَا وَأَخْرَجَ ضُحَاهَا. And he covered it with its night, and he brought out its day within this heavens. Are you more difficult to create than this? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying. وَالْأَرْضَ بَعْدَ ذَلِكَ دَحَاهَا. And after it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the ground, and he subhanahu wa ta'ala dahaha, he flattened it out. أَخْرَجَ مِنْهَا مَاءَهَا وَمَرْعَاهَا. And he brought from within it its water, وَمَرْعَاهَا, its provision for you to eat. وَالْجِبَالَ أَرْسَاهَا. And the jibal and the mountains he put as pegged into the ground for stability? Are you more difficult to create than all of these things? It's an interesting question. Nothing's difficult for Allah to create, but He's asking us, are you more complex or difficult to create? And of course, the answer is, we're not. What's the purpose of these ayats in our context? If you have an ego inside, if you have any arrogance inside, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is reminding you and me. Are you more difficult to create? You think you're hotshot? You think you're all of that? Compared to the heavens? We talked about the heavens before, right? What's the size of the heavens? The first heaven is like a ring that you toss in a desert. And the desert is like that desert is the second heaven. The second heaven is like a ring tossed in a desert. That's the third heaven. And so on and so forth till you get to the seventh heavens. And where are we? A speck? Not even a speck. You can't even see us, right? Are you more difficult to create? Don't walk this earth with arrogance. Tell your nafs, remind your nafs, whenever you feel a moment where you're better than someone, or somebody should be lower than you, remind yourself, am I more difficult to create? أَأَنْتُمْ أَشَدُّ خَلْقًا أَمِ السَّمَاءِ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the creation, and then but He ends it subhanahu wa ta'ala with مَتَاعًا لَكُمْ وَلِأَنْعَامِكُمْ. All of these things that are, you think you're more difficult to create than these things, you're not, but they're all made مَتَاعًا لَكُمْ. They are made for you and your enjoyment, وَلِأَنْعَامِكُمْ, and for your livestock. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is taming us, our nafs. Don't use these things that Allah gave you to belittle other people or to become jabbar or arrogant or put yourself above people. You're not more difficult to create, and those things were made for you, not so that you can claim that you're stronger and better than other people. They were made for you so that you can fulfill your purpose. مَتَاعًا لَكُمْ وَلِأَنْعَامِكُمْ. So don't misuse what Allah gave you to become all, powerful over people or arrogant over people so that you can take a state of arrogance. That's not why things are created. What you're given should not make you arrogant. One of my teachers told me before, it's like somebody that walks, وَلِلَّهِ الْمَثَلُ الْأَعْلَى, to Allah belong the best of examples. Somebody walks out of the palace of a king, and they're basically, the king gave them all this, swag and gold and jewelry. And that person goes out and says, look at me, look what I got, right? I earned all of this. This is because I'm, so strong and smart and powerful. And you just got out of the king's palace. He gave you everything. And of course, the ultimate king is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So anything you have is from Allah. So how can you claim that you're better than other people just because you have it? It's silly. It really is. It's made for you. مَتَاعًا لَكُمْ وَلِأَنْعَامِكُمْ. So don't misuse these things that Allah gave you to become arrogant and oppress people. Use it for what it's meant for. And tell your nafs and remind your nafs that. So let's continue, inshallah, and end the surah. فَإِذَا جَاءَتِ الطَّامَّةُ الْكُبْرَى. يَوْمَ يَتَذَكَّرُ الْإِنسَانُ مَا سَعَى وَبُرِّزَتِ الْجَحِيمُ لِمَنْ يَرَى. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala starts the last section and says, فَإِذَا جَاءَتِ الطَّامَّةُ الْكُبْرَى. When the overwhelming events, Tamma is overwhelming events when it comes. But He also subhanahu wa ta'ala says kubra. So not just overwhelming, it's extremely overwhelming. When that event comes, on that day, يَوْمَ يَتَذَكَّرُ الْإِنسَانُ مَا سَعَى. The human will remember ما عمل. No, ما سعى. It's not what they did. They won't remember what they did. They will remember what they strove for. Sa'a is to strive for something. When you strive for something, is you've set goals and you've chased those goals. On the day of judgment, people will remember what goals they set and what they pursued in their life. what those goals and objectives were. Were they trying to get rich or famous or popular or, become a CEO of a company? Or they wanted to help those who are oppressed or those who are orphaned or build a masjid or a school? Everybody has goals. Everybody. There's not one human being that doesn't have goals in life. If you don't have a goal, it could be your goal is just I don't have goals. It'd be just to live a life with no responsibility. That's your goal. You don't want to trouble yourself. Right? And of course, there are conditions when people obviously have mental health sickness. And I'm not talking about that, right? When people are not driven or have motivation to do things, that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about, goals. People will remember on the Day of Judgment what they strove for. Not what they did, but what they strove for. يوم يتذكر الإنسان ما سعى وبرزت الجحيم لمن يرى. And the hellfire has different names. Jahim is like blazing. Right? And it's made apparent for those to see. So let's end the surah, inshallah. فَأَمَّا مَنْ طَغَى وآثر الحياة الدنيا فإن الجحيم هي المأوى وأما من خاف مقام ربه ونهى النفس عن الهوى فإن الجنة هي المأوى. So now there's two states. So after the person that we're describing the Day of Judgment, they will remember what they strove for. فَأَمَّا مَنْ طَغَى. As for the one who what? Who what? طَغَى. Again. We just started this section, this juzu, and 3 times already the word طَغَى. 3 times. We really need to contemplate this, guys. This is not just at random. فَأَمَّا مَنْ طَغَى. We can't just think Fir'aun is طاغي, where everybody who oppresses knowingly, and we all oppress ourselves. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, تَرَكَ عَلَيْهَا مِنْ دَابَةٍ. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the meaning, I'm trying to remember, there's 2 ayat. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took any soul that oppressed, he would not leave on the face of the earth anybody. ما ترك عليها من دابة. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not leave anyone. If Allah did that to anybody who oppressed, nobody would be left, because everybody oppresses. Now, knowingly versus unknowingly is a different story. We're talking about here knowingly. But we also have to be careful. فَأَمَّا مَنْ طَغَى وَآثَرَ الْحَيَاةَ الدُّنْيَا. And athara is selected and chased after the hayat al-dunya. The life, not dunya, hayat al-dunya, the life of this world. The glamour, the desires. فَإِنَّ الْجَحِيمَ هِيَ الْمَأْوَى. Jahim, the blazing fire, is their destination. Why in this case this description? وآثر الحياة الدنيا, because people follow the dunya to fulfill their desires, and desires are internal. So that's the first half. The second half, وأما من خاف مقام ربه, and those who fear مقام ربه, the status or position of their Lord. Notice it didn't say, it said Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but the position of their Lord. Meaning, yes, we should have fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but Allah is saying here, position of fearing Allah's status, His position. He's all merciful, but Allah's position, and this is again, the prime minister of a country, as an individual, you could care less who that person is, right? It's not that person by name, Justin Trudeau, for example, right? It's not Justin Trudeau that makes that the prime minister important. It's the position of being a prime minister is the importance, not the individual, but the position, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is reminding us of his position. And those فَأَمَّا مَنْ خَافَ مَقَامَ رَبِّهِ fears the position of their Lord. Okay? The one who fears that position. And does what? وَأَمَّا مَنْ خَافَ مَقَامَ رَبِّهِ وَنَهَى النَّفْسَ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ and stops their nafs. Why? Because we're talking about the nafs. To follow its desire. فَإِنَّ الْجَنَّةَ هِيَ الْمَأْوَىٰ Indeed, Jannah is the final destination. So here it is. Here's the conclusion of all of it. You follow your desire, you chase after dunya. Here's your destination. Or you fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you remind yourself of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's status in your life, that He's my Lord, that He's the one that gave me, provided for me, took care of me, and I don't want to disappoint Him, right? And so I will suppress my desires that don't align with Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. Jannah is your destination. And by the way, the default position of the nafs is to do desires that are lowly. They're animalistic, right? The feeling that I want to eat, right? Eating's not wrong, right? But it's all the bare natural instincts or desires, right? We can't limit ourselves to those. We are beyond those. We're above those. Allah elevated our creation above animals. Okay? We're talking about desires that lead to haram, right? Fornication, for example. Okay? Now, that's the default position. If you work on your nafs and purify it over time, you can actually start developing desires and a natural state that aligns with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants. But that takes training. So when the Prophet ﷺ told Bilal, Arihna biha ya Bilal, oh Bilal, make the call to prayer so that we can get comfort. The Prophet ﷺ found comfort in what? In prayer. We have to ask ourselves, do we find comfort in prayer? Or is prayer just a box that we check off because it's time? Or let me just get this prayer out of the way so I can do what I want to do. Is that how we treat prayer? As an example. Versus the Prophet ﷺ, where it was his natural desire that brought him happiness to gravitate towards prayer. You can get to that state where prayer becomes your comfort. That's where you complain to Allah. That's where you seek Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's guidance. That's where you feel, the sweetness of Iman. You can get to that state, but you have to go through the purification process that the surah is talking about. Right? لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يكون هواه تبعا لما جئت به. The Prophet said, none of you will believe until your desire aligns with what I came with. The Prophet says, your desire aligns with what the Prophet commanded, you're in good hands. You're a believer. And that's the measure. That's how we can measure ourselves. So we have to take these as signs and say, how well am I doing? This is not just to hear tafsir, go home, and we have to go home and say, how well am I doing? How do I take my obligations? How do I go extra above and beyond these obligations to Allah? Do I enjoy doing them? Right? Where am I going wrong? Because if I let myself go astray, it will get worse and worse. And or 5 minutes, we'll finish, inshallah. The story of the Sahabi who asked the Prophet ﷺ to make dua because he was poor. Make dua that I'm wealthy, O Prophet of Allah. And the Prophet ﷺ says, are you sure? He said, yes, I really want this dua. And we know the dua of the Prophet ﷺ comes true. So the Prophet ﷺ made dua. This person, he had nothing. He all of a sudden had one sheep or goat. So he started to tend to it. And all of a sudden it increased to more sheep and goats. He used to go to the masjid for every single prayer, but because of now the increased wealth, he stopped going every prayer. He would go he'd go during the week a few times. He'd go to Jummah, but a few times during the week, but not every day, not every prayer, until his wealth became more and more. And it distracted him. And he stopped going to the daily prayers. He just goes to Jummah. And the reason why is because his wealth grew so fast he had to move on the boundaries of Medina. And at the time of Abu Bakr, when he became Khalifa, this person stopped going to the masjid completely. Zero. From every prayer to zero. Do not feel secure just because you feel like you're in a good state that you will continue this way. The forces are against you. You have to work hard to purify yourself. We'll close off, inshallah, with the conclusion of the surah, which is really short. يسألونك عن الساعة أيان مرساها فيما أنت من ذكراها إلى ربك منتهاها إنما أنت منذر من يخشاها كأنهم يوم يرونها لم يلبثوا إلا عشية أو ضحاها. So far, we've covered the types of nufus. We've talked about the state of those nufus on the day of judgment, or the nafs, plural for nufus. Nufus is plural. We saw an example of somebody who did not purify themselves, their nafs. That's Fir'aun. We explained the reality of the nature of the human relative to other creation. You're not complex. Your status is elevated because Allah elevated you. He created everything for your mata, for you, but don't think you're more complex than it. And then we talked about the fate of those who purify versus don't purify. The last part of the surah, to conclude, is يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ السَّاعَةِ أَيَّانَ مُرْسَاهَا. They ask you about the hour, concerning the hour. When is it? This is a question that's given by the nafs as a distraction from facing the reality. The Prophet ﷺ, when he was asked this question, when is the hour? When is the day of judgment? What was his response usually? Does anyone know?
Like the person that's questioned for it.
Yes, so that's one response, but usually is what have you prepared for it? What have you prepared for it? You're asking when. By the way, your day of judgment starts when you die, because that's it. Your actions, your control is done, right? So the question is flawed. When is the hour? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this يسألونك, they ask you, O Muhammad alayhi salam, when is the hour? فيما أنت من ذكرها. What do you know about the hour? It's إلى ربك منتهى. To your Lord, is its finality. It belongs that information belongs to Allah, and only Allah knows. إنما أنت منذر من يخشى. All you are is a warner for those who revere the day of judgment. كأنهم يوم يرونها لم يلبثوا إلا عشية أو ضحاها. That on that day, they will feel like they only lived a عشية أو ضحاها, the time between noon and sunset, or ضحى, which is sunrise till Fajr, basically till noon. That's how it will feel like. So the answer here to the question is, how do you know, O Prophet of Allah? Allah saying to his Prophet, فيما أنت من ذكراها. Allah is the only one that knows. The question is flawed. It's a question that's meant the people of Quraysh asked it in mockery. They weren't asking it because when is your hour? Right? Because Quraysh, how they interpreted things. They interpreted that Allah would react like a human being, hasha. That, we're transgressing. Where's the punishment of your Lord? Aren't we making him upset? Well, usually when you make us upset, we react right away. Where's the punishment? There's no punishment. So we don't believe what you're saying. So when is that hour that you're claiming? When is that accountability that you're saying? They don't believe it. And Allah is saying to Sayyidina Muhammad, you don't know much about it. You don't know anything about it. إِلَىٰ رَبِّكَ مُنْتَهَى. Don't focus on the question of when. We know it's going to happen. Focus on what have you prepared for it. إِلَىٰ رَبِّكَ مُنْتَهَى. Muntaha is, to your Lord is the path, the end path. The final destination is to your Lord. كأنهم يوم يرونها لم يلبثوا إلا عشية أو ضحاها. They will feel on the day of judgment that they've only lived part of the day. So with that, Jazakumullah khair, it was, the surahs are only gonna get shorter, inshallah. The ones at the beginning, Juz' Amma, will take the full class. But inshallah ta'ala, we will continue again next week. Is just for the credit students. Please make sure you come because it's only physical. There's no an online portion. And then inshallah ta'ala, after reading week, we will have an online Zoom. We'll give you the link. Please, please, please make sure you dial in. I would probably say it's one of my favorite surah to talk about is Surah Abasa. And I'll leave you with this thought. How many surahs in the Quran are named after verbs? How many surahs in the Quran are named after verbs? 2. What are they? Yes, but Fussilat could also be interpreted as a noun. What's that? But it's not a verb.